In this video, I'm going to suggest that it's not necessarily the case that if somebody is conservative, has conservative values, that they must also be on the right of the political spectrum. So first, let's talk a little bit about conservatism. What is that? Just to be clear for my UK viewers, I'm not talking about big C conservatives. I'm not talking about the political party, the Conservative Party. I'm talking about conservatism with a small c, which is a sort of a set of principles or a philosophy or a general view, way of seeing the world, if you want to call it that. So when you think of the word conservative, obviously it's made up of the root term, which is to conserve, and to conserve means to maintain something, to protect something, to prevent something from, or to preserve something, right? That's what conservative kind of means in the sense of the word, the English word, conservative, to conserve. Now, what is it that conservatism is seeking to conserve? This is, it's a big topic. But I'm gonna talk about some things which, when we go through these things, we're gonna see that these are not things that are necessarily, the preserve of those on the right or the preserve of those on the left. So the first things first, I would say that often people who are kind of more conservative in their ethos are concerned about interpersonal order, if you like. So interpersonal relationships. So for example, age relationships. So a lot of people will say that black culture, African cultures of people in the Caribbean and Asia and so forth are generally conservative. And often what they're talking about is the age thing and how there's a lot of deference toward age. With age, it comes more authority. Elders are seen as extremely valuable, extremely important and extremely honored in traditional African cultures, same with Asian cultures and so on. And I think that's kind of one of the things that people are, often thinking about when they're talking about being conservative, that they look to the days when there was more order and there was more of a clear order, clear respect for elders. Youth used to respect elders and so forth. I think also as well, certainly sex roles, or what people might call gender roles, but I prefer to use the word sex roles. So the idea that men have certain roles, males have certain roles in society, females have certain roles in society. And then with that, of course, comes roles between, relations between males and females. So one of the things that people often lament is the fact that these days, in this postmodern era that we live in, those kind of distinctions have gone completely out the window, and there is no real distinction anymore between male and female roles in society. And then, of course, you've got family. So people who would consider themselves to be conservative, or others would consider to be conservative, small c, would certainly lament the breakdown of the family. I talk a fair amount about the family and how the family's broken down, certainly amongst black people it's very clear to see amongst black people in the UK, the disillusion of the family and the breakdown of relationships, the very, very large proportion, the majority of children who are born in the UK, black children who are born in the UK here, are born in single parent households. And that's also the case more widely as well. Black people we kind of seem to be the canaries in the coal mine, as that phrase goes, meaning that we experience things way before other people in the society tend to experience those things. So same with, same goes for family breakdown, educational, underperformance, all those kinds of things. It tends to happen to us first, and later on it starts to become more mainstream. But sex roles, gender roles, if you want to call them that, family, those are the kind of things that a lot of, people who consider themselves conservative are seeking to restore, if you like, and preserve. More widely than that, then you've also got what I've written down here, customs and culture. So the days when, there was a shared understanding, much more of a shared set of understandings about how we should relate to each other. Now, this will sound a bit wishy-washy. I'm looking at it and I'm like, yeah, this does sound wishy-washy, but I think there's something in it. Just bear with me. So I think when you think about how we conduct ourselves in public, one of the things that I certainly lament, and many people lament, is the fact that there's no longer, certainly in urban areas here in the UK, there isn't any more that sense of neighborliness, friendliness, looking out for one another. People, you often look at things like vandalism and graffiti, and you just think these people have no sense of respect of the area that they live in. They don't have any respect to other people. They just go around breaking windows, graffitiing everywhere. I mean, near where I live, there's a stream where people, chuck stuff, all sorts, chairs, bikes, just throw it in the stream. And I'm like, fam, like there's some parts of when I grew up, I don't recall really ever walking past any streams. There were no streams where I lived in Hackney and Leighton or where I went, and it's an honor, it's a privilege. I love the fact that we have streams and rivers and lakes all, close to me. And yet people are just discarding all of their junk in there. And there's this is reflective of a general breakdown of that kind of community ethos. People are often thinking about how, there were more cultural ties between people, ties of responsibility, that we were expected to behave in certain ways. When you meet people in the street, you'd be respectful, cordial, that sort of stuff, and recently, this is a bit of a tangent, but talking about these ties of expectations and of duty between people. Recently, I was watching The Godfather 1 and 2 with my wife because she hadn't seen them before. Disgracefully, she'd never seen them before. I love both of those films. And, that something, as I was rewatching it, that's one of the things that really, I think, endears me to that film, is that, yes, it's about these bloodthirsty mafiosos, but when you look at like the wedding scenes and when the Godfather is speaking to, all the different people coming and paying off their respects and this, that, there's all these allegiances which have been built, favors have been given, and, years later they'll go back and like seek to kind of, make good on the sort of social credit that they've kind of built up with these other people. And these ties, I know I'm being a bit vague, but these ties, these social ties that knit people together, these expected behaviors and this reciprocity, all these kinds of things, is what we sorely lack, I think. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of people feel the fact that society is kind of breaking down, and we don't have enough of this anymore in our lives. All societies have that to an extent. And I'm going to be a little bit controversial perhaps and say that I've spoken about The Godfather already, but I would say that this is one of the things that when these youths get involved in these gangs, one of the things that they are attracted to, one of the things that appeals to them that they see in the gangs, is that there is much more of a clearer and more explicit sense of togetherness and loyalty and, interdependence, if you like. There's much more of that in these gangs than you'll find even in your own families, and certainly just in general life. You listen to the song, listen to the music, the drill, and this, that, and the other. There's a lot of talk about honor and loyalty, and supporting your brethren, supporting your fellow gang members, and avenging injuries and stuff that have been done against your fellow gang members, all that sort of stuff. I know it sounds trivial, but I genuinely think these are the things that draw young boys in particular, and girls more increasingly these days, to gangs, is that sense of kind of loyalty and ties of expectation and ties and duty towards one another. I think those are some of the things that a conservative person kind of feels that is dying away in society more generally. Connected to that, of course, is a sense of local identity and connection. And this for me is a huge one. When you look at, I grew up in Leighton. I remember growing up in Leighton in London, and we knew pretty much everybody on the street that we lived in. All the children knew each other. We used to play outside. And gradually, I moved away to various different parts of the London and the country. And then what you've seen now is that more and more of these family homes have been sold. These families have been moved out and been replaced by, not other families mainly, mostly been replaced by landlords who have converted those houses into HMOs, houses for multiple occupation. I think that stands for. So flats, people that rent a room in a house. And with that, unfortunately, it's not the fault of those people who've moved in, but it's obvious that people who are just renting a room and maybe only living there for 1 year, 2 years or whatever are not going to have that same sense of community with the rest of the people who live in that street. And then what you find is that it's a street of strangers, really. My parents' street where they live you do not see people outside chatting to each other and stuff like that like you used to, because that sense of community is gone, because it's a much more transient community. And I think that's something that we're seeing in a lot of urban areas, which is one of the things that conservatives, lament. I think actually that we saw during the pandemic and the lockdowns, one of the things that we saw was an emergence of mutual aid. People suddenly, pretty much overnight, sprang into action and realized that, listen, we're not allowed to go out. We're not allowed to go to the shops. There are some older people here. There are some people who are sick and, people with families, young mothers and stuff like that who are not going to be able to cope on their own. We need to help. And there was a massive outpouring of this sort of support. Me and my neighbours, we used to go next door, ask them what they wanted, because we were going to go to the shop because they're older, not really so easy. And also they were more vulnerable to the virus. And there was loads of that. It was sweeping across the country. And I know it's the same in other parts of the world as well. I think that showed the appetite and the desire for that mutual assistance, that mutual aid, that community ethos, that supporting each other. All of this stuff, is grounded upon a connection to place. And when you have a connection to place, when you have a connection to a locality, a genuine connection and a genuine stake in a local area, then you are going to be much more fulfilled as a person. You're going to be much more vibrant. You're going to be much more alive, frankly, because our life is all about interrelation, not just with other people, but also with nature. And we interrelate with nature by our connection with the land on which we live on. And this is one of the worst ways in which we are suffering, generally speaking, in modern life, is because it's very, very hard to get a genuine connection with the land. The most important way that you get a genuine connection with the land and a stake and a secure place in land is by having a home that you can call your home, your family's home, that you have a right to this space. And of course, that's all been commodified. So you've got to buy a home in the UK, in the Western world. And it's very, very hard to buy a home in the UK these days, as I've gone on about over and over and over again in my videos. And that connection to place as well starts to connect us up, or lead us to the whole, what we're seeing now. With all of this, think about all this stuff. Stop the boats. Take our country back. Take back control. This is all about the land, isn't it? It's all about the integrity of the land of, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's about the integrity of the land, making sure that there's some kind of security as far as who's coming in and who's coming in. And also, more deep than that, that's just the outward sort of manifestation of that desire to be rooted in a place, rooted in a land, and feel like it's your land. Obviously it's being manipulated by the populists, but the general impetus within us, within people, is a very real one, and you could say that's a conservative sort of impetus. Then, of course, you've got, just to move us along a little bit, you've got, of course, patriotism and a sense of pride and identification with your people, the land that you're in, and the people of that land. And I talked about this in the flag video as well. This is something that I feel sometimes those of us on the left can look down on this and view it as it must be something that's necessarily xenophobic and all that sort of stuff. But I disagree. I actually strongly disagree with that. I think that human life must have that element of identification with others on a sort of, not just on a family level, not just on a clan or tribal level, but also on a level that kind of transcends these smaller units and bonds us together in some sort of nation or some sort of country, if you like. And I think that's something where the overwhelming majority of people in this world would be considered conservative, in the sense of wanting to, maintain and preserve some of these national identities. And finally, I want to say as well that, just on that as well, that going back to the land thing and the identity thing, when you think about the Palestine and Israel situation, one of the worst parts of that is that these people, these Palestinians, are being robbed of their connection to the land. That's what's happening. They're being swept off their land. And by a campaign that's specifically targeted at removing them as a national entity, as an entity from that land. So, I just wanted to throw that out there. But one more thing as well, religion and spirituality, often people who are conservative, will also be religiously minded, or, have some sense of spirituality, or some sense of, that there's a deeper purpose and meaning behind everything that is driven by God, or driven by, the divine. And again, this for me cuts across political boundaries. It doesn't mean, it's not to say that just because you have a belief in God or you have a belief in the spiritual, that you automatically have to be also a politically right wing. Not at all. Now, what are the concerns? First of all, a couple of quick concerns, of course, with this is that there certainly is like a latent authoritarianism in all of this, isn't there? Because it's all of these things we're talking about, the social ties, family ties, interpersonal connection, social fabric, customs, culture. Of course, in there's a potential for an overly too much clamping down of individuality and individual expression, and too much of a conformity. So there is a danger in that, for sure. And this curtailing of dissent as well. This is one of the eons long challenges for tradition, generally speaking, is that how do we maintain, our traditional ways of doing things but in a way where they can still be adapted and evolve over time, and allow people to have enough of an expression of themselves and their individuality in a way that can contribute to the whole, but it doesn't mean that they, there has to be the right balance in that. And often I think a lot of people who will balk at hearing this sort of thing will point to the fact that, certain of our traditional cultures were too dominant, domineering, and, oppressive of certain groups within that community. I talked about The Godfather. Look at the way the women are treated in those films, and that's a good example. They were just treated like cattle, pretty much, beaten and just forced to do what the men wanted them to do. That's not universal, by the way. This may well have been the case in a lot of Europe, but it wasn't necessarily the case in other parts of the world. But that's a topic for another day. And the other, of course, one of the other ones is more generally, is that there certainly is a risk of being like dewy-eyed nostalgics. So like, when I was alive, everything was better. You get older and you tend to look back at your youth and think, it was all much better then. Obviously there's a danger of that as well, where it's like, well, no, 50 years ago, life in some ways was a lot worse than it is now. Not everything has got worse. Do you know what I mean? And that's one of the things we have to understand. If you want to, you can be conservative, seeking to conserve the good, but also progressive in understanding that some things did need to change and something needed to adapt. I think about this a lot with regard to Africa, and how it's not just that in Africa that there needs to be a complete reversion to how things were prior to colonialism and slavery, but actually it's about reverting back to the good, but also acknowledging that there were things that had to change, right? Now, let me try and speed along a bit. Now, the reason why I don't think that these things are necessarily, right-wing political things is because when you think about capitalism, you'll see that actually capitalism is in many ways an enemy of conservatism. If you're talking about conserving and preserving some of these things I've talked about, capitalism is all about commodifying everything. Capitalism commodifies land, for example, and this is one of the big problems that we have is land, location, space has been commodified, and so it's difficult for people to be rooted in a locality because they can't afford to be rooted in a locality. That's one of the problems that capitalism has brought. Capitalism commodifies our waterways, it commodifies housing, it commodifies, and this is particularly filtered through technology, big tech. Capitalism commodifies our relationships, it commodifies our attention, it commodifies our music, our culture, everything is commodified, meaning everything is turned into something that can be bought and sold. Even our education now, is being commodified and filtered through big tech. My son keeps getting, they keep putting them on these apps to do their times tables, as I've said before, and it's all about everything now. It's like we barely experience any life except through some sort of market relationship. Even relationships themselves. How many relationships now start on the dating apps? Everything is commodified. And more wider than that, all of the things which are necessary for thriving, flourishing human life are brought into the market. And when they're brought into the market, of course, there has got to be scarcity. And there's a sense in which capitalism dissolves and by necessity destroys those things which give us the quality of life, the high quality of life, and the sense of belonging, and the reality of belonging and interconnectedness and social connections, which is what life's all about. Now, this is something that there was some comments on the video I did about the birth rates in the UK, and we was having a back and forth, and I was saying that this is kind of how capitalism, the prevailing economic system is built on just more and more and more and more commodification, regardless of what it does to society. And the logic of capitalism, profit. The logic of capitalism is such that it will just eventually, it is destroying the grounds even on which it stands, And this is something that I just want to quickly touch on. There was a book I remember reading a few years ago, or parts of a book by an author called Karl Polanyi, and it's called The Great Transformation. And one of the things he talks about this fact of capitalism commodifying everything, including things that shouldn't be commodified, and they're not real commodities, land being one of those things. And he talks about how, we've gone from a time in the West where the markets were embedded in society. So society, community, ecology was the sphere. Markets were just one part of that. But what's happened now is that the market has become the sphere, and everything else has become a subset of the market. And that is leading to the destruction of all of those things, the gradual and inevitable dissolution and destruction of all of the things that give stability and order to our lives. And he talks about one of the things, the great enclosures. Most of you are talking about take back control, take Britain back and stuff. You won't hear these right-wing populists talking about the enclosures and the fact that several hundred years ago, everybody had access to land here in the UK. Common land. There was loads of common land and common resources. Through English common law over many, many centuries had preserved this, just like it was the same in probably most other parts of the world. But starting with around about Henry VIII onwards, the lords and the gentry started to just take the land and claim it for themselves. And it's called enclosure because they'd, put a fence around it. Like, this is my land. You can no longer come here to feed yourself if you need to, like you have been able to, and you and your ancestors have been able to for many centuries, probably millennia. And that great enclosure, it continues to this day. I've talked about the waterways. I've talked about our airwaves, our air. our parks, you could talk about even stuff like the National Health Service. That's common. That's a common good, commonly owned good. The capitalists are constantly trying to take, commodify it, take it, privatize it, shut people out from it. And, this is what the populists won't talk about any of these sorts of things. What the populists will do is, everybody is feeling this decay. Everybody is feeling the effects of this decay and this decay and this disillusion. The boom and bust cycles, the immigration being used as a tool by the capitalists to keep the profits going at the expense of the majority of people. All this sort of stuff. Everybody's feeling the pinch, the cost of living, so-called, the housing crisis. All these things are systemic things. And it's making people annoyed, angry. But what the populists are doing, instead of pointing to, well, let's look at the economic system that we have. It's unsustainable for us, for our land, for our ecology and all that sort of stuff. They're pointing people's direction at outsiders, at immigrants, at asylum seekers, at people with different colours, different faiths, different religions, and so on. And they're appealing to the lizard brain in us, the lower vibe, the lower part of our consciousness, which is fight or flight, animalistic thinking. And it's all fear the outsider, fear the immigrants, fear this, fear that. And for me, this is where I think that those of us who are not on those right-wing populist kind of, trajectories, this is where we need to do some work. I think too much of the time, people on the left have probably associated themselves with progress too much. So it's almost like there's a gleefulness about, families breaking down. Yes. There are no more rules about how men and women should relate. Yes. Do you see what I mean? There's like this like almost gleeful acceptance of the breakdown of everything, social and cultural, breaking it all down, even national identity, break it all down, get rid of all of it. And I think that is one of the main things that turns most people, probably most people off from those who are currently on the left, because they see these people, these left-wing politicians, as basically as enemies of the things that they hold dear and that they cherish. I think that those of us who are more left, or progressive or whatever, we need to engage with these issues. We need to stop lambasting or lamenting the fact that working class people are in many ways quite conservative in a lot of their views on things. Instead of thinking, right, they need to change, you need to change. We need to change. We need to change if we're actually saying that we're claiming that we're here, our ideas are best for the majority of people. Well, let's engage with the majority of people and make sure that our ideas are actually in line with the good that is, that they want to preserve, if that makes sense. I know it's rambling a little bit, but we need to find a way to re-engage and to reconnect with those values, those ideas, those things which people hold dear and which people feel that are slipping away from them. And in such a way that we can, point people's directions at some of the root causes of these things, and also work with people to come up with some solutions to all these things. It can't just be, let the government take over. That's another thing. Statism has got to go. Just one dimensional, just nationalize everything. That will sort it out. No. Let's find a way where we can revitalize local politics, revitalize local participation, bring back people's assemblies, bring back, local autonomy and local decision making. That's, I think, what we need to do. Because I genuinely think that, if people in local areas, had the mechanisms to do so, that they would take control of their issues. And I actually think that once you do that, then whereas, some of these populists are just saying, it's the immigrants, even though people are living in areas where there are barely any immigrants whatsoever, and those that are there are such a tiny number, people would start to realize that actually, when we're talking about the provision of special educational needs in our local area, this has got nothing to do with immigrants. This has got to do with funding. or this has got to do with the way that we've set up our education system here. Or when you're talking about the lack of access to parks and waterways and stuff, this has got nothing to do with immigrants. This has got to do with policy decisions that have been made by local authorities over the last several decades, which have sold off our assets on a local level and so on and so forth, you know? So that's just my thoughts on that. So just to summarize, for me, being conservative is by no means necessarily a right-wing thing only, or must mean that you're on the political right. On the contrary, I think that there is huge fertile grounds in conservatism, in social conservatism, for more left-wing and radical politics, as long as those left-wing and radical politics actually speak to the concerns that people have in their actual material conditions that people are in and the economic systems that people are, on a local level. If we can do that, speak to those local issues, then I think we could start getting a lot more cut through in the political sphere. I want to recommend a channel, by the way, called Cronx Watch. Cronx Watch. It's a YouTube channel. This guy, brilliant channel. He's like a citizen journalist, and it's based in Croydon, and he does videos breaking down what's going on in Croydon, what the local authorities are doing, what corporations are buying up this piece of local commonly owned land or hospitals or this, that, and the other. Those are the kind of channels I think we need to see more of, that are actually shining light on actually what's actually happening on a local level, rather than just spouting just general political slogans and sound bites which connect with global and international issues, but don't connect with local issues, if that makes sense. So anyway, that's just my thoughts on this. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well on this point. What do you think? Conservatism, is that necessarily, regressive or right-wing, or actually do you agree with me that actually conservatism is something that is almost like depending on how you define it, it's just like a base instinct that most people have. And it's not a base negative instinct. It's a base positive instinct that connects with those things which make us human and which make us give life purpose and meaning and value. Take care of yourselves. There are some other videos that you might be interested in here. There's one here which YouTube will recommend. And then there's one here which I think goes nicely with this topic. Take care of yourselves, and I'll speak to you soon. Peace.